Those who've been bashing up the federal government to introduce carbon taxes and reduce emissions beyond what the UN require us to, well, they've scored a victory of sorts. It all began, of course, with the PM on Waikiki Beach, Honolulu, and as our bushfires ravaged the country, the political pylon began. One man was being held responsible, and not the man or woman who actually, in this country, at natural disaster time, tops the list on top of the chain of command. No, not the premiers. It was the Prime Minister. And it's been a pylon of immense proportion, despite his Herculean efforts of relief and rebuilding since that time, which has seen him activate both the ADF and reservist forces in numbers never seen before. Meanwhile, the Victorian and Queensland premiers, who were also holidaying for longer than Scott Morrison was, they copped very little heat. I wonder why that could be. Could it be because they too were coalophobes? They were on the side of huge emission promises, no more coal, all renewables, and of course that meant the closure of baseload power. Yet no one could seriously question what the Prime Minister Scott Morrison has done since he came back to Australia from Hawaii. Apart, of course, from an ugly handshaking incident at Cobargo, given, where some of the locals there, I think, could have booed Santa Claus if he'd turned up instead. The climate change activists even hit the streets as the fires burned out of control. And yesterday, they drew blood and extracted a shift in policy.
My intention, and this is the key point, to meet and beat that target.
Thanks to these carryover credits.
Well, if we're in the position where we don't need them, and we're able to continue to reduce our emissions and use the technology and make the investments and continue to evolve our policy to ensure that we can reduce our emissions within the policy framework that I took to the last election.
Let's talk facts. There's no doubt that the planet is warming. The stats are quite consistent, and we've warmed, on average, by roughly 1.5 degrees Celsius in 110 years, 1 degree Celsius in 50 years. But the Prime Minister knows that while climate change is real, although it's taken a while for him to say that, and may be impacting our droughts and bushfires, although scientists can't agree by how much, nothing we can do in Australia about CO2 will change the weather.
We could close down every single power generation facility in the country, and those emissions would be taken up by China in about 9 days.
So this is interesting. Here's my question. If he's right there, and he is, and therefore if the chief scientist is right about cutting all CO2 emissions and still having no impact on warming, and he's right too, why did the Prime Minister make both those statements I've just played in the very same interview? They're entirely contradictory. If China's emissions dwarf our greatest efforts, as he pointed out, why is he then saying, in another breath, the government will evolve its emissions targets? Why? For what result? Not to reduce the likelihood of bad bushfires, because it won't. And if we were to go it alone, as former PM, the old miserable ghost himself, Malcolm Bligh-Turnbull, says we should, just cut emissions, cut them to the quick, and the rest of the nations around the world will follow, will it really push the might of China, India and the United States, the three monster emitters, to reverse all their policies and statements on climate change? As if. Never. So have we now got a government in this country acting on and changing policy to appease the loudest voices? Voices who stupidly think that we can change the weather from little old Australia. These protesters should be rallying and baying for blood, not outside Kirribilli House as they've done again today, but outside the embassies of China, of India, of the United States. Now, according to climate scientists, they can change the rate of warming. Those three nations can. Now, I foreshadowed a shift on climate policy and philosophy from the Prime Minister on this program last Friday because the ill-informed, nasty narrative was getting nastier and it was getting louder. And now the narrative has transformed into fact, as it so often does on the political landscape, via today's news poll. The PM's preferred prime ministerial rating copped a battering. The party, not so much. What should concern Australians now are the new costs, larger subsidies, taxes that will need adjusting up as the government shows the electorate it's listened and will cut emissions further. You can't go down this path without pain. And right now, Australia can ill afford more pain, especially, ironically, as the bloke who became the fall guy for these devastating fires has just thrown the kitchen sink at relief and recovery. Billions of dollars in cheques being written. What do they say? In politics, perception is more important than the truth. We've now got a government which is about to fix the perception irrespective of the truth.